Around town. It's for sale in various places, but it's a pictorial book that covers Bond County, and it's really an interesting book. Another book that Kevin was involved in was Forts and Blockhouses of Early Illinois. He's got 2 volumes of this, co-authored with Bill Wilson, and so there's two different editions of that book. And then also he's written with Bill Wilson Tales of Hill's Fort, and we have 2 different volumes of those. So if you're interested in any of those, Kevin didn't ask me to do this. He didn't even know I was going to do this, okay? But we have these books available at the Bond County Museum, and if you want to pick up some, I brought some with me tonight. But we're anxious to hear Kevin's presentation tonight on Abraham Lincoln's rebel in-laws. So please give a welcome to Kevin Kaegy.
Got to look and see if I've got a few notes here on some of this stuff. I'll be mostly speaking from the, I guess, is this, yeah, it's on if I get it in the right position. Well, it's good to be with you this evening, and thank you all for coming out. I've always enjoyed talking about Abraham Lincoln and some of his family, and I've done the parts of this talk off and on over the years a number of different times. Abraham Lincoln's family, he was kind of unusual in the situation that he had. He was somewhat alone in this life. His mother had passed away, his sister had passed away young. He really only had his stepmother and the step siblings and so forth. They're saying to turn this up. Can you hear this, Eric, or not? I just need to get closer. Ah, okay. Killed it? All right. Now I can hear myself echoing a little bit, so that must be right. All right, Abraham Lincoln, as I started saying, was somewhat alone in this life. He didn't have a lot of his own personal family, but he did have his stepmothers and some of his step siblings. However, he wasn't terribly close to them. The family that he actually associated with more than anything else was, of course, the Todd family. He was very closely associated with all of Mary Todd Lincoln's family throughout the years. And tonight's talk is a little bit about how they all reacted to the American Civil War, and a little bit about the history of this family and how they all interacted differently. What was very unusual about it is her family was all from Kentucky. Kentucky did not secede from the Union. It was one of the border states. However, most of the Todd boys had started separating and moving away from home and going further south. And it so happened that virtually all of Mary's family ended up serving in the Southern and in the Confederate armies. And Lincoln, of course, was elected president of the northern wing of the party. Of Lincoln's family, the ones that he had here, this is a poster of them all up here together. Mary Todd Lincoln was the son of Robert Smith Lincoln, and Eliza Parker Lincoln. The first family of the Parker Todds, they refer to them as, was the first part of the family, born in Lexington, Kentucky. It was a family of 7 children. The 7 children were Elizabeth, who married Ninian Edwards, Francis, who married William Wallace, Mary, who married Abraham Lincoln, and Anne, who married Clark Moulton Smith. George, the youngest member of that family, became a surgeon in the Confederate Army. He was the one man from that first family of Todds that joined the Confederacy. Robert then remarried to Betsy Humphreys Todd. Her picture's up here at the top. And after he married her, that was Mary Lincoln's stepmother. There's much written about her not getting along famously with her stepmother. Betsy, however, was an unusual situation. Betsy was married to this man. She ended up marrying a widow. As soon as his wife died, the family had a number of slaves that helped take care of the children. Mammy Sally was one of the ladies in the house. Nelson was the manservant and the man that drove the carriage to help go get the groceries. And then there was a nurse named Judy, and she helped out in the house. So the several black servants that they had there in Lexington helped take care of the children. Also, Grandma Parker, his mother-in-law, came across to help take care of the children after the first wife died. And his sister-in-law, she came over to help take care of the children. Robert was gone. He was out courting and sparking a young lady, and her name was Betsy Humphreys from Frankfort, Kentucky. That was the state capital. And so he had met her, and within 6 months, he'd asked her to marry him. And she was going to wait the proper amount of time. She wanted to wait a year. She just kind of put him off until the proper amount of time had passed. Once she got married to him, she gave birth to 9 children within about 16, 17 years, I believe. It was every other year. The first child died in childbirth, and then all the rest of them survived. So all the other siblings they had, there was Levi and Margaret and Martha and David, Samuel, Emily, Dee Dee, Alec, and Kitty, the last one of the family. And it was a very large family. It was a very large family. As soon as the older children got old enough to move away, Betsy basically encouraged them to move away. And this wasn't just the stepchildren. This was her own children. She needed to get some space in the house, and that's kind of the way she did things. So as soon as Elizabeth was old enough, she was moved out on her own. She got married when she was about 18 years old and married a man who was going to Transylvania University to become a lawyer. He was the son of a governor of Illinois. His name was Ninian Wirt Edwards. And they got married and they moved to Springfield and took up housekeeping up there in that area. And that became the northern wing of the Todd family. Once she moved up there, she encouraged her next sister, 2 years after, Frances, to come up. They would have parties and cotillions at the house of the Edwards mansion out there on Aristocracy Hill. It was located the Edwards home was located just south of where the Illinois State Capitol is today, in what is, I believe, called the Centennial Building. It's a museum building. That was the site where the Todd home was there. And they would have parties and so forth out there because of his political connections and his father's connections and stuff in the area. Frances came up. She was introduced around. She actually dated Abraham Lincoln. But she later recalled dating him. She said, oh heavens, he was the plainest man and the most boring individual she'd ever met in her life. She ended up marrying William Wallace instead. Mary came after that. After Frances was secured with William and settled in, they invited Mary to come to Springfield. And Mary came to Springfield, and she was introduced to the different crowd of people around during the social seasons. And then she settled on Abraham Lincoln. They became engaged and then eventually broke off that engagement. A couple of years later, the seed was still burning, shall we say, and they were still kind of liking each other, and they ended up getting back together and did in fact get married about 1842 finally, and they did marry. After that, the last sister from that family, Anne, came up and she met Clark Moulton Smith. Now, the way they all reacted in the Civil War, the way this family worked things out, Abraham Lincoln appointed him as a paymaster. Ninian was appointed a paymaster in the United States Army for the Illinois troops and volunteers. He was raising funds for that. He was also making a little extra money on the side, and a lot of the Republicans were complaining to the president, well, you shouldn't have appointed that Democrat to do that. Well, it was his brother-in-law. So it was creating some problems, and eventually he was removed from office because of the patronage and the takes that he was involved in. William Wallace Lincoln was a doctor. He was Lincoln's family doctor. One of their sons, Willie, was named for him. He became a paymaster in the United States Army and was serving out east. And he served honorably without any questions of anything. Mary, of course, in the White House during the Lincoln administration, there were several times when she was accused of having Southern sympathies and so forth, because so many of her family was actually serving in the Southern Army, and nothing could have been further from the truth. There was some concerns of things that happened during the White House. Mr. Watt, one of the gardeners in the White House, had let some information leak out about one of Lincoln's upcoming speeches, and it made it in the newspapers and so forth, and that was somewhat attributed to Mary, but Mary had never had any part of it. One of the things that this whole family ended up running into was problems with the press. Since Mary Lincoln's family was from the South, it was assumed she was a pro-Southerner, which was nothing could have been farther from the truth. Like I say, all of the northern wing of the family did stay loyal to the North, and then many of the Southern family members did not. But they were all caught one way or the other. Ann and Clark stayed in Springfield. He ran a department. He ran like a clothing store and so forth. One of the things he did, he was one of Lincoln's closest friends. He basically told him, Mr. Lincoln, he was being overrun at the Capitol building there in Springfield whenever he was preparing for his inaugural address. He let him use one of the storage rooms above his store. His store building still exists. It's on the south side of the square, just in from the Lincoln Law Offices, right there in that area. It's about, if you know where the big bookstore is on the south side of the Springfield Square, it's like the building next door to it. That would have been Clark Moulton Smith's general goods store, and then one of the offices above there, Abraham Lincoln used in 1860, and that's where he wrote his inaugural address. They were always very good friends. George, the brother George, he was a surgeon. He was actually a talented surgeon, but he was also a rather heavy drinker, and he was not very well liked within the family. In 1849, earlier than Lincoln, of course, Lincoln's time in the Civil War and all of this had come out, 1849, Robert had passed away. The father of the Todd girls had all passed away, of all the family had passed away, and George had sued the estate. There was a will that was made up. He'd contracted typhoid fever. He knew he was passing away. He was an attorney. He wrote his own will. He only had one person witness it. George contested that will on the fact that there was only one witness on it, and so it had to go to court, and what they ended up doing was selling the entire estate. Now, his mother, his real mother, died in childbirth, and his stepmother had raised him from the time he was 1 year old. Literally, she had always been with him. However, he and her never did get along, and he insisted on basically selling everything. So the Todd home in Lexington was lost at that time. It was sold at auction, and then the money, Betsy was treated just like one of the other children. She received a share of the estate, but even her own dishes, her silver, things that came with her when she got married had to be sold. Some of her brothers, the Humphreys, actually bought those things back. At that point, Betsy and the remaining children had to move out to a country home they had that she owned with her brother called Buena Vista. It was out west of Lexington, and they lost the home in Lexington at that time. One thing kind of unusual about this, most of our American presidents have a home associated with them. They'll have a family home that becomes a museum that they have for people to come visit and so forth and learn about their life. There's only one first lady whose home has been preserved from her childhood, and that is Mary Todd Lincoln. And she is, oddly enough, probably one of the most easily misunderstood first ladies we've ever had. But her home in Lexington on Main Street is a museum. But that's not only does the story, it's kind of odd with her sisters. Two of her sisters' homes are also museums. They're not museums to them, but they are museums. Anne's home in Springfield, Anne and Clark's home in Springfield, is also the Vachel Lindsay home, who is the poet from Springfield. So right behind the Illinois governor's mansion is that nice two-story white house with the green shutters behind it. That is where Anne and Clark Smith lived. That is their home. So it is actually serving as a museum. Oddly enough, Martha was married to a man. He was a Southerner. He was a doctor. His name was Clement White. They lived in Selma, Alabama. Their home is still in existence, and it is part of a museum complex in the city of Selma, Alabama. It's like a little guest cottage there on the grounds of this Sturtevant Hall, which is a large museum, and it's like the next door neighbor's house, and it's part of this museum complex. But it's kind of odd that there's only one first lady who has a museum named in her honor, and it is Mary Lincoln, and two of her sisters also have museums in their houses as well. Of the second family, Levi Todd was, he was the son that stayed at home, and he was the one son from the Southern family that stayed loyal to the Union. Levi was loyal to the Union, but Levi had a lot of problems. After his father had passed away, he was the man in the family that had run the family mill. They had plantations, and they had plantations, farm, a distillery, and a mill. So they had various businesses that they run. Robert had his oldest son taking care of his oldest son of the second family taking care of that. However, he just kind of run adrift after his father passed away. There was nobody there to take the orders from or do orders with. He lost his job because George had ordered selling everything, and then all of that estate had to be divided up. So basically, Levi lost his job. He eventually took to drinking too much, and then he eventually lost his family. And he died during the American Civil War of want and starvation in a hotel in Lexington. He just basically just kind of despaired and didn't really do anything. He was asking, he'd sent several letters to Lincoln saying he was going to encourage several people to vote for him and help carry the state of Kentucky for Abraham Lincoln. And by the way, could you loan me $200? You know, I've always been good for it and always supported you and everything. So he was still asking for money, but actually did finally pass away during the American Civil War. But he did stay loyal to the Union. Margaret married a man named Charles Kellogg. They run a department store in Cincinnati, Ohio. So they were right across the Ohio River, basically straight north of Lexington, where all the Todds had come from. They had an unusual situation during the Civil War. They were from a northern state. They attended Lincoln's inauguration. They attended it. So did Elizabeth. They attended the presidential inauguration for him, and then they were asking him for patronage jobs, which they did not get. They didn't get it because he was sitting in the hotel room complaining about, I don't know why the Union is, why they're pressing all this stuff about a Civil War coming up. The Southerners should be left on. He was very pro-Southern in all of his sympathies. And he very much said so in the hotel, and word got back to Lincoln, and finally he didn't get his appointment. So then he left, he went back to Cincinnati, and then he struck on a different idea. He thought, well, if the northern people don't want me, maybe the Southerners do. So he crossed the river and managed to get along with some of the other brother-in-laws and so forth, serving further in the South, and attached himself to one of the Southern armies about 1862. This was right before the Battle of Shiloh in Corinth, down in where that battle took place. He was there during that period of time. He did not serve during the Civil War, but he served on the medical staff helping nurse people back to health for the Southern armies. So here he was, a northern man traveling with the Southern Army, giving aid to the Southerners at that time. He didn't seem to see any problem with this. The problem was the friends that he had in this was Albert Johnson, who passed away, that knew him. Albert Johnson passed away. A couple of his brother-in-laws were there, and they knew him and knew his sympathies, and they were transferred out, and he had been sick for a few days, and when he came back, he went to one of the leaders of the army at that time and said, well, I need a pass so I can go back farther north. And they said, well, who are you? What are you doing here? Why are you here? You can't be here with the army. You need to go to Montgomery and try and get a pass. So they sent him to Montgomery, Alabama, and they finally just arrested him, and they threw him in jail, and then shipped him to Richmond and put him on one of the Richmond. He didn't realize his situation as a northerner traveling with the Southern Army, and he's blowing and bragging about his relations with Abraham Lincoln. He was his brother-in-law and stuff like that. And all of a sudden, everybody's like, why are you with the Southern Army if you're a northerner? So he was basically put in jail. They finally did get him out and ship him back to Cincinnati, and he finally had the sense to stay home. But that's how Charles reacted to things then. David Todd would have been about the next child born. David was kind of an unusual character. He ran off when he was 14 years old and joined the Mexican Army and fought in the Mexican War. He then joined the California Gold Rush. He then served in South America and Chile, fighting in a revolution down there. He was kind of the braggadocio one that was always writing letters home. A number of his letters home to his mother survive, and so they kind of put together a trail of where he was and what he was doing. But he did not ever marry and settle down until several years after the American Civil War. He was one of the ones that would brag about how he would run Lincoln through with a sword if he ever saw him. The fact is, David, I don't think ever actually had the opportunity to meet Abraham Lincoln. Most of the others did at some point in time. Lincoln never met George, and he never met David. But to my knowledge, I don't think he ever met either of those two, because he was gone the couple times Lincoln was ever around that family and so forth. Martha, the next sister we'll talk about, had married a man that had went to the medical university in Lexington. His name was Clement White. Clement was a little small man, 107 pounds, and he was a surgeon. He was a doctor. He was always thin and frail, thin and feeble, shall we say. And the sisters all worried about poor Clem. He'll never make it in the Civil War. He will never be able to make it as a soldier, as a soldier's life. However, he did serve. He did serve during the American Civil War. He served as a surgeon in the American Civil War, and he did survive the war by over 30 years. He died in his 90s. He passed away about the turn of the century, and he is buried down at Live Oak Cemetery down in Selma, Alabama. That is where their home was. Martha, his wife, had kind of an unusual situation with her. She decided she was having some health problems. She wanted to come farther north. She came back to Washington, got into Washington, called in the White House, but the White House would not let her in for some reason. They did not know her or maybe believe it was her. I'm not sure what the situation was, but she was not allowed to come in. So she went around on a shopping spree. She was there buying a wedding gown for some friend of hers and so forth. And she had a number of trunks of merchandise and things that she was taking back south with her. She received some medical care while she was in Washington, D.C. She then wrote to President Lincoln, got a pass to go back south. And so she was able to cross the lines and go back south. When she crossed when she got down to City Point, Virginia, where they would pass the lines and they would let people go through, Ben Butler was in charge of things, and he saw this woman come through. The fact was she had 14 trunks of merchandise with her. She was probably sneaking some contraband into the South. She went straight to Richmond and bragged about sneaking contraband into the South, and then it got into the newspapers. And the fact is, nothing really ever happened. She had this wedding dress. She kind of said about taking things back south, and she did take things back south. Her trunks hadn't been searched. But this became a great scandal for the Lincolns because all of a sudden he'd given this sister-in-law a pass to go back south. She had over 14 trunks of merchandise with her. There may have been some contraband in it. There may not have been anything in it, but the story was that she'd snuck a Civil War coat with solid gold buttons back into the South, and this made all the Southern newspapers. And what it was is they were printing this paper because the Southern women were not going to let the men lose the Civil War. The Southern women were going to hold them up and do it. So this story spread like wildfire about what this woman had done to help the Confederacy, to help the cause, help the glorious cause, and so forth. The fact was, it made a wonderful story, but there really wasn't much truth to any of it. Martha passed away shortly after the American Civil War and is buried with the rest of her family in Lexington. Samuel Todd was one of the other older boys next to David in age. Samuel, sir, he had went down to New Orleans, and he had met his wife Cleely down there. Her father run a florist shop, and he started selling flowers. He was a salesman is what he had done. David had also served down there in the New Orleans area, and he was basically a used car salesman. He sold used carriages. They were both in New Orleans when the war broke out. That's how they both ended up attached to units. David was one of the sons that passed away during the Civil War. He died at the Battle of Corinth is where he passed away. And Mr. and Mrs. Lincoln both felt great pangs of sorrow when they did lose him. But the Lincolns could not show any sympathy over this, even though he was a family member and one that they did know and actually know quite well. Him and Cleely had about 5 children, and a number of those children have descendants to this day yet down in that area. Emily Todd Helm would be the next one to talk about. Emily was the one Lincoln referred to as little sister. Mary, in her life in Springfield for years prior to the Civil War, actually did for some of the younger girls exactly what her sister Elizabeth had done for her. She invited the girls to come up and stay with them. Emily was one of them, Kitty was the other one, and Dee Dee was one of the others. So 3 of the girls had come and spent some time with Abraham and Mary Lincoln. So they got to know these younger girls quite well. She came up there, but she was already attached somewhat to a young man from down in Elizabethtown, Kentucky. His name was Benjamin Hardin Helm. Lincoln got to know him quite well. He ended up being an attorney. He came to Springfield to do some legal work there, and while he was there, he stayed with his brother-in-law and sister-in-law, Abraham and Mary Lincoln. So they got to know Ben quite well. Ben was the highest ranking officer to serve and became a lieutenant of what they called, he was in charge of what they called the Orphan Brigade. The Orphan Brigade was a group of Kentucky soldiers that had joined the Confederacy to fight for the American Civil War. Even though Kentucky stayed in the Union, it had a brigade. They called them the Orphans because they simply couldn't come home. They had to cross that line to get back north, and they couldn't ever come home. And that was one of the problems with the Todds. They were diverse and spread out all over the country at that time. Ben Hardin Helm served until the Battle of Chickamauga. At Chickamauga, he was shot off of his horse, and he did pass away from that. Lincoln grieved greatly over this. He was very, very close to this young man. Mary was, too, very close to this young man. Immediately, letters started passing back and forth between the family and the White House. Betsy Betsy, the mother, wanted to get down into the South. Emily was traveling with her husband. He had been injured in a previous campaign. She had went down to help nurse him back to health. He had gotten healthy, but she was stuck in Atlanta, Georgia at the time with her children. And so she needed to get back north. Basically, the pass got through. Betsy went down there. Betsy and Kitty went down to Atlanta, got her, and brought her back. When they got back to the line to cross at City Point, Virginia, Emily refused to sign the oath of allegiance to the United States, and they telegraphed Mr. Lincoln and said, "This is your sister-in-law. She's refusing to sign the oath of allegiance. What should we do?" And he said, "Send her to me." She went to the White House, and she stayed with Abraham and Mary Lincoln for about 2 weeks. They stayed as guests in the White House there and talked about the sorrows of losing these several brothers that had passed away during the Civil War, as well as Mary's loss of her son, Willie, in the White House. Next daughter would be Dee Dee, we'll talk about. Dee Dee had went south with Martha and Clem White to live with them in Selma, Alabama for a brief period of time. And odd as it may seem, when I talk about the Todds being spread around and involved in different things, these two girls were in Selma, Alabama. They were staying in Selma, Alabama. That's where Clem White and Martha lived. When Jefferson Davis was inaugurated as president of the Confederacy, it took place at Montgomery, Alabama, about 35 miles east of Selma. Believe it or not, these two girls were at the inauguration of Jefferson Davis. 2 weeks later, Elizabeth and Margaret and Kitty were with Mary Lincoln at Abraham Lincoln's inauguration. It's just funny that there were Todds at the inaugurations of both presidents of the country at that particular time. At the ball, being sisters of Mary Lincoln, they became kind of the celebrities at the ball. At the ball, she met this man here. His name was Nathaniel Henry Rhodes Dawson. And he was a widower with 2 small children, and he was looking for another wife. And he spotted her in Emily. He spotted her in Dee Dee. He spotted her and thought, she's the one for me. And they started writing letters back and forth to each other. He had joined the Civil War. He was a true blue Southerner of the high social type. He was not one of the lower. You can even tell just by the looks of his uniform that he's wearing. He was not just a volunteer. He was a wealthy lawyer, plantation owner, and so forth. Just several unusual connections with him. He was a very well-known, very well-liked man from his community. He wanted to get married right away, and Dee Dee just refused to do it. She said, "No, I don't even know you." And they started up a correspondence, and they started writing letters back and forth. And oddly enough, those letters ended up preserved in the Southern Historical Society collection in Chapel Hill, North Carolina. Not the place you would expect to find anything about Abraham Lincoln's family, but lo and behold, his brother-in-law and sister-in-law, their letters back and forth during the American Civil War, which basically helped trace the movements of all the Todd family members as she's telling news, and they're learning and meeting each other. The book here called Practical Strangers has recently been published just in the last few years, which has all these letters back and forth, so you can learn a little bit more about this very, very unusual family and how they interacted with each other. Now, they had several children, and then she passed away in childbirth about 10 years after the passing of the Civil War. But Nathaniel Henry Rhodes Dawson had quite a career. He became Secretary of Education in Washington, D.C. He was appointed by President Harrison and I think President Garfield as well. He had several high-ranking jobs there. I think he served from the House of Representatives. He was an attorney serving in Selma, Alabama, and he was a practicing attorney. Nothing particularly distinguished about his military career. He did serve throughout the Civil War. But one thing that's very unusual about him that I find just completely shocking. This is one of those just kind of unusual history, how history touches on each other. Okay, you've heard of Selma. I mentioned Selma, Alabama several times. Can anybody tell me what happened significantly in Selma, Alabama in 1965?
Bloody Sunday.
Bloody Sunday. Where did it happen, Jim?
At the bridge.
At the bridge. What's the name of the bridge? Pettus Bridge. Edmund Pettus Bridge. Does anybody know who Edmund Pettus is?
KKK.
He was a United States Senator from Alabama. He was also a Grand Knight of the KKK. He also served during the American Civil War. His legal partner in Selma, Alabama was Nathaniel Henry Rhodes Dawson. Now, isn't that an unusual coincidence that this The Edmund Pettus Bridge, which still stands today, where Martin Luther King led 3 different marches before they finally got across that bridge. I've always thought it odd that that bridge is named the Edmund Pettus Bridge for a man who was the Grand Knight of the KKK. That happened long after his association with him. Their association dated back during the Civil War, and then Pettus passed away in like 1920s. That bridge was built about 1940. Why it was named for a man that had been passed away and gone for 40 years, I don't know. But that civil rights marker, that bridge, that historic site of that bridge, is named for that man. And that man actually had, oddly enough, some connections towards Abraham Lincoln. I just think that's kind of an odd instance when you run into something like that. Last couple I'll mention, Alexander Todd. Alexander was the youngest of the Todd boys. He lived out west of Lexington near his mother and near his younger sisters. He was about 22 years old whenever the Civil War broke out. He did go south and join up with his brothers and with a man, William Herr, who would become his brother-in-law eventually, and they ended up serving. He passed away in the Battle of Baton Rouge. He was in a leading unit, which was out riding ahead as a scout unit. They fell into an ambush. They got fired on. When they turned around to run back and lead warnings back to the troops behind them, they were fired on, and he was killed in a friendly fire incident. He was the youngest of the Todd boys. He was also very close to Mary, and Mary took that one also very, very hard. The last of the girls was Kitty. Kitty had served, she was not involved in the Civil War, although she had been in Springfield during Lincoln's run for the White House. She was there during that period of time. And then shortly after the Civil War, she married William Herr, who had been involved with her brothers and her brother-in-law, Ben Hardin Helm. And with them, it was through their connections that's how they ended up meeting each other. They met and married, and then she passed away a few years after the Civil War in childbirth. Oddly enough, of all of the people in here that I've mentioned on this, the 4 girls that originally moved to Springfield are all buried in Oak Ridge Cemetery. Of course, Mary and Abraham Lincoln are in the Lincoln Monument there at Oak Ridge Cemetery. If you go across the valley, straight north of them, the Edwards plot is on the next hillside north of the monument, just straight north of the monument. All of those families and most of their children and grandchildren are buried there on that Edwards lot, so they're all there. In Lexington, Kentucky, most of the rest of them are buried there. The ones that are not there, George is buried out in Camden, North Carolina, where he ended up living after the Civil War was over. He ended up out there practicing as a doctor and a physician. He was a gifted surgeon, but he had a lot of personal problems. He was twice married, went through a couple divorces, didn't get along great with his kids. He didn't get along with any of his family, either the northern wing or the southern wing of the family. He was just kind of out on his own. David did get married shortly after the Civil War. He married a lady and had a little girl, and they ended up living in New Orleans, where he took up selling used carriages again. He was a used car salesman is what he became. He passed away about 1871. He is buried down in New Orleans in that area. Emily lived the longest of all of them. Most of them had passed away by about the turn of the century. Emily Todd Helm, her husband Ben Hardin Helm, had passed away during the Battle of Chickamauga in 1863, I believe was the year that battle took place. She was widowed and her husband had passed away. She lived another 70 years beyond him. She lived about 60 years longer than her mother. She lived about 50 years longer than all of her sisters. All of the young sisters all passed away relatively young in childbirth, and virtually all of them were brought back to Lexington, where they are buried in the Lexington Cemetery. So they are all gathered there. Now, a little bit about some of the sources here about this unusual family, because they were, as I mentioned, on any of them, because of their unusual connections, they were very familiar with each other. They very much had respect. They had profound respect to some extent for the Lincolns. The only two that really didn't, George and David, really were quite outspoken in some of the things that they said about the Lincolns. The other girls really weren't. Martha and Dee Dee were together in Selma, Alabama. They attended Jefferson Davis's ball and inauguration and so forth, and that's where Dee Dee met her future husband, was at that ball for Jefferson Davis. They came back to Selma, and they were involved in fundraising events. And one of the fundraisers that they had was a great fundraiser. They were sewing and making bandages and doing whatever they could. They decided to hang an effigy of Abraham Lincoln up. And the Todd girls were absolutely incensed about this. How could they possibly be so insensitive to their needs? They knew, after all, that that was their brother-in-law. And although they didn't agree with his politics, that was just beyond propriety to do that sort of thing. And because of that, the Southern held them at arm's length. They didn't really trust being around them because they were Northern sympathizers. Isn't that odd when you think of it? These two girls living in the South attend Jefferson Davis's inauguration, but they weren't really trusted and allowed to join in society too much because they had too many close ties to the North. The same thing that happened to Margaret and Charles Kellogg. They were in Cincinnati, but they had family and so forth in the South. They were never quite trusted. And all of them had to deal with that in their own funny way. The Todd family was quite torn by the American Civil War, and most of them actually, several of them passed away during the war. Two of the brothers, one of the brother-in-laws that had served, another brother-in-law served and survived it by many years. That was Clem White. And then William Herr, he also survived a number of years. He's buried in Louisville, Kentucky with his children. But his wife, when she passed away, was brought back to Lexington and buried with all of the family. So, like I say, it was just an interesting, kind of a colorful group of people. If you want to read a little bit more about them, House of Abraham was written about 4 or 5 years ago. This is all about the Todd family and some of the divisions in this family. I haven't went into a huge amount of detail on it, but enough to kind of whet your appetite about it. Practical Strangers, as I mentioned, was about Dee Dee and Nat Dawson here. There's 2 little books now. They belong to the Ages of History of the Oak Ridge Cemetery, and all the families are buried there, including the Todds and the Lincolns. They're all buried up here. The other one is the Kentucky Todds in the Lexington Cemetery. This is all about the different families that are interconnected. All of her Mary's grandparents, great-grandparents, most of her siblings are all buried in Lexington Cemetery. Over here on this side, I have several things about Abraham Lincoln. Of course, it is February. Abraham Lincoln's birthday is coming up here in the next week or so. I do a lot of talks about Abraham Lincoln. As I always mention about him, the one thing I think about with him is he made more specific, lasting achievements in human liberty in our country, not only keeping the country together during the American Civil War, but in giving freedom to the slave and assuring freedom to the free is what he did. This is part of the reason we read so much about studying Lincoln so much. There are many, many books written about him. My house holds quite a few of them. Of the things I've got here, several pictures of Lincoln, pictures, prints. This is actually one of my newer ones, or older ones. This is from about 1864 of Tad Lincoln reading a photograph album in Brady's studio. There's another little CDV of it over there, and a picture of Mary Lincoln, another one in Mary in her inaugural gown with Abraham Lincoln on the end. There's also pictures of some of the Todds and the cemeteries and so forth up here. So with that, I will go ahead and draw things to a close and open it up for a few questions for you. If you've got anything, I'll see if I can answer anything for you and let everybody get on with the rest of their evening. So with that, I'll draw things to a close now. Do you have any questions? Yes.
I read once that Abraham Lincoln and his stepmother were very close.
Yes.
Is that true?
Yes, they did get along very well. Betsy got along very well with her son-in-law. I'll tell you another one that was particularly close to him was Elizabeth. Elizabeth was, she was the oldest of the first family. She was the oldest of the first family, and she was kind of like the second mother for all of the girls in the family. She particularly really liked Abraham Lincoln. There was a couple of statements that she made. In fact, it was in that book I was reading it the other day. She was saying about one of the things about Mary was greatly misunderstood because of health problems, manic depression, and so forth, that she really suffered. Mary Lincoln had a lot to suffer, without a question. She lost she lost basically 3 of her sons. The 4th son, Robert, did survive, but he had to commit her to asylum for her own protection at one point in time. She had her husband shot literally out from under her arm while they were holding hands at Ford's Theater. So she went through a lot, but she did not do it well. She was not the grieving widow. she made herself kind of a spectacle of herself in doing it. And it was hard to like Mary Lincoln sometimes and some of the things she did and said. And that was just kind of the way she was. Elizabeth understood this. Abraham Lincoln also understood this. Elizabeth knew what Abraham Lincoln had to deal with her, because she also loved the same lady. And whenever Mary did get out of the asylum, whenever she got out, and she wasn't in, I shouldn't say it that way, as an asylum. She was actually in like a guest cottage on the grounds up there at Batavia. That building actually still exists. It was like a private apartment that she stayed in there, where she was very well cared for. And it was really for her own protection, because she was sewing all of her money into her undergarments and stuff, and she imagined people were trying to rob her, and she was always checking on Robert to see if somebody had poisoned him, and just out of her head on some things. And that's part of the reason he did this, was to help protect her. Eventually, Elizabeth and several other people worked with Mary and worked with Robert and said, Robert, why don't you let her come stay with me in Springfield? And that's eventually what she did do. And then when she did recoup her health a little bit, she was able to travel back to Europe again and stay abroad for a couple of years. And then when she came back, she did die in the Edwards Mansion on Aristocracy Hill in Springfield about 1882. Is when she passed away. But Elizabeth looked after and cared for him. But Elizabeth was particularly close to Mr. Lincoln. And whenever Willie Lincoln died in the White House, Robert, Mary was just inconsolable. He just basically sent his Aunt Elizabeth a telegram. Aunt Elizabeth, you have to come. You're the only one I know can take care of Mom. And that's exactly what she did. Elizabeth was immediately out. Even though she had her own problems, her own family's needs, Elizabeth was always there looking after her. But Betsy also very kind to Mr. Lincoln. And like I say, immediately when she needed a pass, Mr. Lincoln immediately wrote it out to get her down south to get Emily back. And then literally brought Emily to the White House to look after her, as he'd done in his own house years before. Anything else? Well, Carrie, I'm going to turn this back over to you. I will be around here. If you guys have any other questions, feel free to come up and take a look at some of the pictures. I'll be glad to answer anything I can for you.